Can everyone hear me clearly? Awesome. Thank you so much for showing up today. We know it's super early or super late for some of you. And welcome to the Society of Gender Professionals Virtual Gender Cafe, Rethinking Binarism. I'm Thảo Nguyễn, she, her, and I will give you a brief intro about SGP before we give the mic to Brenna Kutch, one of our presenters. This is a two-part series that builds off of a gender cafe last year that I organized called Beyond the Binary in International Development. And today's focus is binarism in our everyday lives. Next slide, please. Before we start, we would like to hold a moment of silence in support of ongoing efforts to dismantle structures of white supremacy and to build collective power to intervene in violence inflicted on Black communities. We express solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement and protesters in pursuit of liberation, justice, and freedom. We know that liberation from all forms of oppression is intrinsically connected. Thank you, everyone. And now, before we begin this Gender Cafe, I want to quickly introduce the Society of Gender Professionals for those of you who may not already be familiar with us. SGP is an international association of gender practitioners, academics, and activists dedicated to promoting feminist action and applied research and raising the profile of gender expertise around the world. On the screen, you can see our mission, which includes to support member collaboration, network building, mentoring, and leadership, and to advance gender equity. Next slide, please. We have members all around the world, and we launched our new website and membership structure with exclusive benefits last year. You should check out our website, genderprofessionals.org, and become members if you haven't not already. One of the things that SGP does is to foster the production and dissemination of applied gender research, is to host gender cafes. We have one every few months. These are virtual conversation series connecting gender practitioners, academics, and activists to explore pressing gender issues and questions. These gender cafes also provide the space for non-hierarchical sharing, questioning, and learning beyond the classroom. And these gender cafes are also professional development opportunity for members interested in raising the profile of gender expertise. Next slide, please. Before I introduce our first presenter, let me quickly explain that we are all currently in the same Zoom room, but after the presentation, we will break out into separate rooms to have a discussion. We will not be recording the conversations in the breakout rooms. The only thing you need to do is click on the button that says Join Breakout Room once it pops on your screen. Before we return to the main section, you will get a warning on your screen and you will be brought back to the main room without any action on your part. And now let's get the conversation started. First up, I'm going to introduce Brenna Kutch. Brenna from Portland, Oregon is a professional in human resources and organizational inclusion. She currently works at USAID in Washington, D.C., where she is on the board of the Gender and Sexual Minorities Employee Resource Group.
Thanks, Tao. And hello, guys, gals, and non-binary pals. Can everyone hear me? Tao, thumbs up? Cool. Thanks to everyone who's joining us today or watching at a later time. Next slide, please. Before we start, I'd like to take a minute to talk about Pride, which is this month. So in the US anyways, in other countries. In June of 1969, Marsha P. Johnson, Sylvia Rivera, and many other trans and queer people stood up to the oppression that they were facing in an event now known as the Stonewall Riots. We now honor their sacrifice and the progress that has come out of it by celebrating Pride every June, which is a time to promote the dignity, equality, and visibility of LGBT people. Today, we acknowledge everyone who has and is currently standing up to injustice around the world. This month, we are reminded that justice and equity come from the sacrifices of those with the courage to fight for it, and that we all enjoy the freedoms gained as a result. Next. So, for our agenda today, I'm going to talk a little bit about sex and gender and binaries, and then Chris Burden will talk about their experience with colonialism and gender in the Philippines. And then Noelle Schroeder will walk us through a reflection exercise that we'll do on our own for a few minutes. So then after that, we'll split up into those breakout rooms and discuss for about 15 minutes, then come back together and review some tips on inclusivity real quick. Then lastly, we're going to have an unrecorded Q&A for the last 15 minutes of our time. So please feel free to ask us questions. If you'd like to ask an anonymous question at any point during the day, you can send a private message to SGP Anonymous and they will ask for you during the Q&A time. If we don't have time to answer everything, we'll get to it and answer those in our resources document that we'll share out after. Next. Our goals for today are for everyone to learn a little bit more about sex and gender and binarism, since we're all coming from different places of knowledge. Even though there's no one right definition, we want to create more shared knowledge around some terms that are often misunderstood. We hope that you will leave with a better understanding of the impacts of colonialism on modern day gender around the world, and to recognize and interrupt the gender binary in our everyday lives. In session 2, we'll go more in depth about the binary in our work, so if you haven't registered, please check it out. And then lastly, many of us want a to-do list of how to be more inclusive. I know I'm constantly looking for these, but advocacy and inclusivity really need to start with understanding, which is what we're going to provide today. Next. Before we get started, I'm going to briefly introduce you to who you'll be seeing both today and on June 24th for session number 2. Next. So Chris, Noelle, and I will be presenting today, and then Tao, who introduced, also did that great Gender Cafe that you can watch online, Beyond the Binary and International Development. Nazim, Sebastian, and Crystal will be our panelists for the June 24th session, and then Rashima and everyone else here other than Crystal are going to be breakout session hosts today, so you should see one of us in those breakout sessions. Next. Okay, so gender and binarism, which is why we're here. Next. First off, what even is gender? This is my million-dollar question, so if you have the answer, please let me know. So to start, we're going to look at what gender is not, which is sex, on the right-hand side here. Sex is the biological construction of our body, which includes things like sex organs and chromosomes. Sex is often assigned at birth based on genitalia, only as male or female, and we'll talk about intersex a little bit more later. Gender, on the other hand, is that internal sense of identity. If someone asks you what gender you are, many of you would be able to immediately answer because you feel it somehow internally, no matter what sex you were assigned at birth. However, gender is a concept that is defined by social and cultural norms and includes things like roles, behaviors, and expressions. Some people even talk about feminine or masculine energy, which is like the vibe someone gives off, like, oh, she has such feminine energy. But of course, that aligns with some social definition of what feminine even means. A part of the gender puzzle is that this definition changes across time. So for a basic example, nowadays in the US, we think of pink as feminine, but until about 100 years ago, blue was the delicate feminine color, and pink was the strong masculine one. So a young girl wearing pink then would have been considered masculine. Meg John Barker, who is a fabulous gender researcher in the UK, talks about how gender is biopsychosocial. And this means that our neurons, hormones, psychological makeup, societal influences that we grew up with, all of this and more form this big messy concept that we call gender. So this is a very complicated topic, and I know it's a lot, but throughout our time today, please just remember that gender and sex are not the same thing, and one's internal sense of gender identity is what defines their gender. Next. So just to make sure we're all on the same page, I'm going to be using these terms throughout the session. So cisgender, or we will say cis, refers to people who do identify with the sex or gender they were assigned at birth. So a cis woman is someone assigned girl at birth who internally identifies as a girl or woman. Transgender, or trans, as we will say, people do not identify with the sex or gender they were assigned at birth. So a trans woman would be a baby assigned as a boy at birth who internally identifies as a girl or woman. In both examples, both women identify as such based on their own perception of what woman is, which is definitely not a straightforward definition. Non-binary people do not experience their gender as strictly male or female, so their gender exists outside of these two buckets, such as somewhere else along this spectrum in the image here. Some non-binary people consider themselves trans, since they do not identify with the sex assigned to them at birth, and some do not. Whether or not a non-binary person identifies as transgender is completely up to them. Also of note, gender-affirming surgery or medical intervention, such as hormones, is never, ever required for anyone to be legitimately trans or non-binary. Again, sex and gender are totally separate things, and different people have different opinions on their bodies, just like cis people. This is also a reason that we use the term transgender more now, at least in English, because it's about gender. In many places, we no longer use the word transsexual. First off, it's because gender identity, as we've covered, is not about sex. but also because this term has been deemed derogatory by many people in the trans community, and we need to respect that. So please always try to have an updated understanding of the acceptable terms to use for any marginalized group in your community or in your language. Next. For the purposes of our discussions, we're using the phrase non-binary as a blanket term or umbrella term to describe all gender identities that fall outside of woman or man. So as this image demonstrates, many genders fall under the non-binary umbrella, including agender, gender fluid, gender queer, and lots more. There's so many different genders around the world, both currently and in the past. A few examples include the Hijra in the Indian subcontinent, Two-Spirit in some North American indigenous groups, Warrior in Indonesia, and many, many others. But for now, we acknowledge this term is imperfect, overly generic, and fairly US-centric. Next. So then, what is binarism? The dictionary definition of binarism is a mode of thought predicated on seemingly stable oppositions, such as good and evil, or male and female. Thanks for reinforcing our Gender Cafe, Merriam-Webster. This is seen as an inadequate approach to areas of difference, which is why we are all here today. Binarism says that only two separate categories can exist, and everything must fall into only one of these two categories. When we talk about rethinking binarism, we're asking you to think about what exists outside of these given categories and how the binaries are harmful to the people who do exist outside of them. Next. So now that we've talked about gender for a brief minute, we have two poll questions. I hope everybody can see the poll. This is our first time doing polls. So the questions are, before today, I have reflected on why I identify with the gender I do. And the second one is, I identify as binary, which can be man or woman, non-binary, or not sure. So, okay, great. I see questions coming in. Water break. Just gonna give another second. Okay, great. I'm going to share results. I hope you can all see that. If not, it looks like most of you, 97%, have reflected on your gender identity, and some small minority have not. And then identification as binary, man or woman, is 86%, and then some non-binary and not sures. I love the not sures. Keep thinking about that. All right, I'm going to do stop sharing. And back to the presentation. So next slide. I don't know how this looks to all of you watching, so I hope you can see my screen. All right, so binarism, like I said, is simply that either or option. So it's represented in this image on the left by boy or girl with those pesky pink and blue colors. But some of you may have noticed I used a sort of female to male spectrum on one of the previous slides. So we're slowly moving away from the binary, and these terms are now sometimes defined on spectrums. So this one represents the identities that fall between boy and girl, which is good. This is progress, but the Trevor Project has gone further in looking at them in one more dimension. Great. So this beautiful amoeba model represents that things are more complicated than a spectrum. It also shows that boy and girl aren't necessarily the two opposites. So in this model, we have the classic boy or man on the left, girl, woman on top, but also non-binary, agender, and a whole lot of places to fall in between. I encourage you all to think of this model, this amoeba, when you see a spectrum or a binary of anything in the future, just to think about things in a different way. Next. So the Trevor Project uses these beautiful amoebas to describe gender identity, like we just saw, but also gender expression and sexuality. So briefly, gender expression, we have classic binary terms like masculine and feminine, but also androgynous and genderless. Someone could be a feminine man or a masculine non-binary person or one of a million other configurations. Gender identity and gender expression do not have to be correlated. Then on the right is sexuality. You can be attracted to men or women or non-binary people because yes, that is a thing, or not have any sexual attraction, which is what we call asexual, etc. So this is not tied to gender identity or gender expression, again. So here's an example. When I was growing up, boys were assumed to be masculine and attracted to women, and the opposite was true for girls. But these things are not necessarily related. So while my childhood peers may not agree, it's possible for a girl who is androgynous to be attracted to men and non-binary people. Or as another example, drag queens can enjoy performing femininity, but still be straight men, cis men. This also means you can't tell someone's gender identity or their sexuality by looking at them, especially considering a lot of people have to remain hidden for safety reasons. One of the unfortunate things about combining all of these identities under the LGBTQIA+ umbrella / rainbow is that binary thinking still exists. The LGBT movement has traditionally been most useful for the rights of cis gay men, yes, despite the trans women of color who pioneered it, as we saw earlier. Non-binary and binary trans people can face different forms of oppression when it comes to social acceptance of gender identity and expression. So next time you see someone conflating gender identity, expression, and sexuality, now you can think back to these amoebas. Also, as a caveat, there are gender identities across the world that do have an interdependency between gender and sexuality. So like I said, there's no one right answer or way to think about these things. We're just talking about them a little more disambiguated, if that's a word. Next. Okay, so we talked about gender, which is that internal sense, but now we'll talk about sex, which is based on biology. Intersex characteristics are those that do not fit medical or social norms for female or male bodies. There are over 40 varieties of intersex traits, which can include androgen insensitivity, congenital adrenal hyperplasia, micropenis, various combinations of chromosomes such as XXY, and many others. Because these bodies are different, people with intersex traits experience stigmatization, discrimination, and harmful practices. One of these is non-consensual medical interventions to make their bodies more typically female or male. So despite what we're taught in high school biology class, sex also isn't binary. And since sex isn't just genitals, some folks find out about being intersex at various stages in life. So they can find out as babies, but also during puberty or when trying to conceive. Next. An estimated 1.7% of people are born with intersex traits, which makes them as common as being a redhead. But who do you hear more about? We have a very long ways to go just to create awareness around what intersex is, much less advocate for their equal rights in a binary world. Since sex and gender are not connected, people with intersex traits identify with a range of genders just like people without intersex traits. They can identify as cis, trans, non-binary, etc. Again, that's up to them. Next. The legal rights for non-binary and intersex people vary widely around the world. Some places allow an other marker for sex or gender on legal documentation, but most do not. There have been some advances in legal rights over the past few years, but there's still a very long ways to go. So I encourage you to learn more about these laws where you live. And every time you ask for sex or gender and documentation or a demographics question, I encourage you to think outside the binary and advocate for change. Of note, not all non-binary or intersex people want to identify themselves as such officially due to concerns around safety, general privacy, government record keeping, etc. But we want everyone to have the option. Next. So a little bit about pronouns. Pronouns are how you talk about someone, such as she went to the store with her friend. She, her, and he, him are the standard English pronouns, which are binary. Non-binary examples include they, them, so they went to the store with their friend, or z, zier, z went to the store with zier friend. Also, the image points out that MX, pronounced mix, is the gender-neutral version of Ms. or Mr., which is becoming more common on forms in the US. So please add it on your forms. They is generally considered gender neutral if you aren't sure about someone's pronouns or their gender, which people frequently use in English. So for example, the whistleblower submitted their report last week. Don't know their identity. Most people find it easy to use they when a person and therefore their gender is unknown, but find it difficult when someone explicitly asks for they pronouns to be used. So please practice, practice, practice. We all have decades of conditioning. It's very hard, but we definitely can change it. Someone's pronouns do not necessarily tell you their gender identity. So some non-binary people can use he or she pronouns. Some use he and she and they. And just like with gender identity, you can't tell someone's pronouns just by looking at them. So just believe people and use the pronouns that they ask you to use. Trans-binary and non-binary people are at a much higher risk of mental health issues and suicidal ideation related to a lack of support for their genders, which are often very marginalized. Using the correct pronouns shows respect and is a free and simple way to possibly save lives. If you make a mistake, which happens to all of us, correct yourself and just move on, don't focus on it. If you aren't sure what someone's pronouns are, include yours, introduce yourself with yours, and they might do the same, or you can just ask respectfully. Most people would rather you ask and get it right, and then you can correct others if you hear that person being misgendered. Some people really like being asked their pronouns because it means you're paying attention and you're not just assuming that they are he or she. This is obviously just referring to English, and not every language has a good alternative for gender neutral pronouns. Which brings me to the next slide and our second poll, which is asking about language and gender. So the first question asked about your ID or passport options, and then the second one about your native language. So we'll give it a sec. These are well-timed water breaks. Cool, we'll give it another minute. Answers are still coming in. I wish there was a way to show the answers without stopping the poll. Okay, so I'm going to end poll here because we have most of the answers in and I want to move on. So if you can't see the answers, it says that 15% of you have more than 2 options for sex and gender, 63 do not, and then 22% of you aren't sure. Yeah, it also depends on, you know, where your country and your city and your state and all of that. Then my native language has gendered pronouns. 80% of you said yes, but 20% said no, which is really interesting. Oh, oops. Share results if I didn't do that before. Again, this is new. Okay, so next slide, please. So speaking of language, this is how I process stress, and I made this map last night. So in our 200 plus registrants, we have 49 countries represented in our registrations for the specific session. And I'm sure we have at least that many languages, if not a lot more. So keeping that in mind, next slide. Language is really important and adds so much fun complication to everything. So depending on where you were raised and what language you speak, you will likely think about gender differently. Some languages, as we saw, do not have gendered pronouns like he and she, and some have a lot more than 2. This image is an example of some neutral pronouns in various languages. I'm sure it's not comprehensive. Grammatical gender is a system that assigns a gender to nouns and also exists in many languages. And these genders don't always align across languages. So for example, the moon is la luna in Spanish and Italian, which is feminine, but in German it is der Mond, which is masculine. So I'm guessing the moon is gender fluid, which is very nice. In many languages, the default person or animal is a binary male, and as feminists will tell you, when person is defined as man, which used to be ubiquitous, including like all of the laws in the US, that's bad news. So in some languages, you can have a group of 99 women and non-binary people and 1 man, and the gender of the group will be binary male. Then when it comes to addressing others politely, we generally say things like ladies and gentlemen, which is binary. You may remember I used hello guys, gals, and non-binary pals, which I did not come up with at the beginning of this presentation, but you can also say friends, colleagues, everyone, comrades. There's so many different ways in English to not and address people in a gendered manner. To say excuse me to a person on the street, you would likely say excuse me ma'am, or a señora, or mademoiselle, which puts the speaker in charge of assuming someone's gender, which leads to misgendering, especially for non-binary people. Maybe we can just say excuse me without adding on that gendered honorific. Language with all of its rules and variations is very complicated, but progress and inclusion come from pushing that tradition. Having the words available to describe or even recognize ourselves is essential. One of the reasons that there have been an increase of out non-binary people in the US in the past few years is simply the fact that people are like, oh, that's an option. There's a word for how I feel. Language is also important for how marginalized groups are spoken about and how they're treated socially. So for example, the word queer was derogatory for a long time, though now it's been reclaimed by some people in the LGBT community. Next slide. It's hard to remember to say that. Non-binary genders are not new. Gender diversity has existed for thousands of years around the world, but our current understanding is heavily impacted by colonialism and Western culture. So in the resources page that we'll share, we'll include a link to this really cool PBS map, and it shows some non-binary genders and gives a little bit of information about them all over the world. And I'm sure there are many more than this map includes. I strongly encourage all of you to do some research to understand the gender diversity where you grew up and where you live now. How sex and gender are treated differs across cultures as well. So while Western societies may assign sex and gender at birth, this is not always the case. So for example, the Igbo of Nigeria appear to assign gender around age 5, and the Mbuti of Central Africa do not assign a specific gender to a child until after puberty. Next. So that was the briefest overview of a very complicated topic that I can manage. And now I'm incredibly pleased to introduce Chris Burden, who is going to share with us more about colonialism and gender. Next. Chris is a 23-year-old graphic designer from the Philippines, which is why their slides look so nice. Although not identifying as a trans man, they're very active in the local community through trans men equality and awareness movement. Chris, it's all you.
Hi, thank you for the warm introduction. So yes, I'm Chris, and today I'll be talking about how colonialism has affected the LGBT community in the Philippines. Next slide. So I'll have 5 main talking points. First, I'll have gender and sexuality related terms in the Philippines, ancient Philippine mythology and gender identity, Spanish colonialism and the introduction of Catholicism, the American influence, and the current repercussions of said colonialism. Disclaimer, I am not an expert on these topics. This is all through personal research and lived experiences. So if you have any specific questions, I might not be able to answer them, but I'll do my very best. So the gender and sexuality related terms in the Philippines, I just wanted to familiarize people with how LGBT people are treated in the Philippines through the language that our people use. And first off, I just like to introduce this little rhyme that people in the Philippines use. It goes, girl, boy, bakla, tumboy. It basically means like cishet girl, cishet boy, feminine gay guy, and masculine like butch lesbian. So that's how they see us. It's just stereotypes. And the next line, we have this word silahis. This means bisexual. It's not very used often, but are they derogatory terms? Well, bakla now is used in the same way that gay, the word gay was used to mean something bad. People use it as an insult, but over the years, people have reclaimed it in the same way bakla has been reclaimed. And tomboy is the same as well. The next slide, one more. Thank you. So bakla and trans women and tomboy and trans men. So a lot of the trans people in the Philippines still, well, because of the hermeneutical injustice, which means that they don't know the terms to describe themselves, so they don't describe themselves in that way. A lot of gay people who were to be considered trans don't identify that way because they don't know the word exists. So they identify as cis and or gay. So there's a lot of relationship between the words, but I'm not a binary trans person, so I won't speak too much on that topic. Okay, next. So ancient Philippine mythology and gender identity. First, I just want to explain how the gender identities were respected and they existed before the colonizers came, and that we have mythology to reflect that. First, we have Libolan, god of the moon, patron god of homosexuality. A lot of gay guys use him as their patron god, and they use him as his icon and inspiration and representation. And then next, we have Lakapati, goddess of fertility and agriculture. There's a word there that I censored. It is a word I know a lot of intersex people are uncomfortable with. I just wanted to mention that just in case you were wondering. Lakapati is the goddess of good harvest, and while she is referred to with feminine pronouns and feminine language, a lot of modern researchers think she is intersex, but as a mythology, it is all up to the interpreter to see how it was said. Next. So in another ancient thing that happened is there are what we call, please, next, thank you. The Philippine shamans, aka babaylans, they usually embodied a feminine role, so either women or feminized men, or what we in the modern day would call trans women. They were seen as important members of society and were regarded as women in all aspects except for the inability to give birth. Not to say the ability to give birth is the only thing that makes you a woman, but that's what they regarded back then. And on the right, you can see an artistic depiction of what a babaylan might have looked like. Next. I just wanted to mention the binokot, which are female warriors who in battle would transition to male. But I just wanted to mention because binokot are more of a fantastical story than what babaylans are, which are historical accounts of gender diverse people. Next, please. Okay, so here we have what I consider one of the turning points in Philippine history, the Spanish colonialism and the introduction of Catholicism. So the Spanish colonial period of the Philippines began when explorer Ferdinand Magellan came to the islands in 1521. Next, please. They brought with them Catholicism and all the gender hang-ups that come with it. And here in the drawing, oh, sorry. If you just go back a little bit. Thank you. So there's the Battle of Mactan, and you see how the natives fought back with the invaders. The Philippines experienced 300 plus years of colonization. And that, okay, next please. So shamans that were seen practicing their own faith and worshiping their own gods were considered heathens and enemies of Catholicism. The Spaniards brought Catholicism to the Philippines as a means of subjugating the natives. So a little bit of motive for them besides just bringing the religion. Next, please. Alongside Catholicism, Spanish rule also introduced a lot of gendered language, like gendered furniture, gendered places, gendered work, like gendered occupations. And next, please. Spanish culture also introduced the machismo culture, in that men who acted in any way other than the masculine way, they would be seen as feminine and therefore inferior, and they would be like disgraced. Anyone falling outside of the binary were disregarded entirely. Next, please. So the American influence. After the 300 years of rule under the Spanish, we have the Americans. And under the Americans, we find a pathologization of queers and the introduction of the hetero-homosexuality division. Under the influence of Americans, the social categorization of queer identities as abnormal and unacceptable continued. And I'd just like to show this piece of propaganda that the United States put out. It shows the character of Uncle Sam looking down at the lowly Filipino as Spain watches. Next, please. So current repercussions of colonialism. Queer people are tolerated but not accepted at all. They're expected to follow certain roles and stereotypes that make up their identity. For example, gay men are seen as makeup artists or hairstylists, and Filipinos only depend on them for the things they can do and don't appreciate who they are. An example of this is a celebrity here called Jake Zyrus. He's a trans man. And while people love him because, he's Filipino and he's a celebrity, so we should be proud of him. But then when it comes to his gender identity, they disregard him entirely. Next, please. Because of the Philippines' hardcore religious history, progress in equality is extremely difficult. On one note, there are only two places in the world that don't recognize divorce, and that's the Philippines and the Vatican. So you can see how much progress we need to do in that side of things. Next, please. So in closing, I just like to make this statement. Colonialism has left deep scars in the history of the Philippines. Gender identity was more or less respected before the Puritans arrived and subsequently erased them. I am not against the religion itself, but the people who use it to discriminate against others. So thank you for listening to my presentation. I hope you learned something, and if you have any questions, then I might be able to answer them later. And I also have the next slide. I have my sources if people would like to see any more about this talk. Thank you. Okay, so now we have our third poll, I believe. Does your country have a history of gender diversity that is different from how it is constructed or perceived by mainstream society today? As you can see, my country had that. Ooh. Nice. Should I stop the poll?
Maybe give it, I still see answers coming in, so just
Okay.
a few more seconds.
Just tell me. Or is someone else controlling, or should I do it?
I can do it, I think.
Okay.
I'm going to click end poll and share results, and we'll see if that works.
So there's a lot of yeses. Okay.
And also I'm seeing a lot of not sures. So for those of you, I think you now have a great homework assignment.
Mm-hmm.
Cool. I'm going to do stop sharing, so it should be back to the screen for you, Chris.
Okay. So now I'm gonna introduce our next presenter. Noelle is a feminist activist, educator, and organizer in Washington, D.C. They have a decade of leadership and experience in nonprofit management and international solidarity work. So I hand it off to you, Noelle.
Thank you so much, Chris. That was a really incredible presentation. I really appreciated that. We can go to the next slide, please. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what this really means in practice and how continuing to focus gender equity work and gender practitioning around a binary can be harmful. We can click, please. So first, setting gender only as this girl or boy binary erases the identities of all of the people who live outside of that. And as we saw during Brenna's part of the presentation, that's a lot of different identities. Next click, please. When your identity is erased, it's really, really hard to convince people that you exist, that you're real, that your gender is valid and should be expected and accepted. And that has implications across all of the different ways that we do gender equity work. So in the ways that we collect data, in the ways that we talk to people in communities, in the ways that we talk to decision makers. So by using this gender binary, we're reinforcing the gender roles that many of us who are gender practitioners are actively trying to work against. So what that really means is our work isn't working if we continue to reinforce a gender binary, and that's harmful for everyone. Click, please. So we know that gender roles, the ways that gender is conceived of within different societies, the ways that different genders are expected to behave and act and perform, are heavily policed, meaning that people who act outside of those norms are socially punished. We see that in all cultures across the world. We see that even in, and particularly in the United States. We spoke early on in this session about the need to protect Black lives from state violence. And one of the, unfortunately, several people who was murdered by police this week in the United States in this past week was a trans man who had posted publicly on Facebook close to his murder that he thought that he was being targeted by police because of his gender. So gender binarism is extremely harmful, and it's important for gender practitioners to start to break it down. So we're going to do an activity to start to understand our own conceptions of gender and how they play out in our daily lives. Next slide, please. Thank you. So the first thing that we want you all to do is make sure you have something to write with. This can be a pen and a piece of paper. You can have a notes app open on your phone. You can have a Word doc open on your computer. Someplace where you can write. All right, next slide, please. Thank you. So our task today is this. We're going to practice one tool for exploring our experiences with the gender binary. This is a tool that you may have used before in reflecting on gender and social norms. We're going to use this tool in a slightly different way. So we're going to take it a step beyond reflecting on gender roles and stereotypes. We're going to use it as a way to talk about our own personal experiences with gender and specifically with the gender binary. So this is a tool for you to improve your own skills and knowledge. A caveat, this is not going to give us the strategies to persuade and advocate on gender equity. This is about surfacing the aspects of our daily lives that are visible or invisible. And we're going to use that to talk more about it in small groups and build some shared meaning about what gender means in our lives. Particularly if you're a cis person, these are really good tools and tactics to reflect on your own understanding and use of gender. So here's what we're going to do. You're going to have about 3 minutes to work on your own independently to draw a picture or write a narrative about a typical day in your life, starting from when you wake up until when you go to sleep, including when you hear all of these garbage trucks in the background. I apologize for the background noise. But in this narrative, we want you to focus on how the gender binary shows up throughout the day. So during your daily life, when you're at school, you're at work, you're doing shopping, you're taking care of children, how does gender show up? What's visible and invisible? When gender shows up, is it specifically binary genders? Are non-binary genders present in the way that you talk to people, in the way that you express yourself throughout the day? There's a lot in here. This is a longer activity that we're really compressing for a short period of time, but we want you to start using this as a way to begin exploring the gender binary in your own life. So we're going to take 3 minutes for you to work independently, and then we're going to go into breakout rooms.
I'm going to start a timer now and try to put on some background music. So Noel, let me know if that works. Can you hear? I won't sing, it's fine.
We'll take about 1 more minute. All right, folks, if you're not finished with your activity, that's absolutely fine. Can we go to the next slide, please? So we're going to go into breakout rooms now, and we'll instruct you on how to do that again in just a second. But in these small group discussions, you'll have the opportunity to share what you created, to share a little bit about the story or the pictures that you created to examine how the gender binary shows up in your daily life. Within these discussions, we have a few guidelines that we want everyone to follow. First, we want this to be a safer space. Please be respectful that people are sharing their personal lived experiences. Please share the time equitably. We want everyone to be able to participate, and we also want to center and amplify the experiences of members with marginalized identities. This means if you're a person who doesn't hold a marginalized identity, absolutely please share, but be mindful of the time or the space that you might be taking up within that group. And a final reminder, and this is a phrase I really like when I'm facilitating sessions: stories stay, learning leaves. In these small groups, which will not be recorded, we're going to be sharing our personal experiences. And we want this to be a space where folks can be comfortable and vulnerable to share those things. Please do not go out after the breakout groups and share someone's personal story. that they shared in that small group. Like, oh, so-and-so just said that they had this experience and wow, that was wild. But what you can take out of that breakout group is what you learned. So-and-so shared a story about X and I really learned Y. And that's what stories stay, learning leaves means. Next slide, please. So we're going to take you into breakout groups. We'll have about 15 minutes in your small group to discuss what you created in your activity. You'll get little pop-up messages that will tell you 5 minutes and 1 minute warning when we're close to the end and when you can wrap up. You'll have a moderator within each small group who will help keep the discussion going. And if you have any questions or need any help during the breakout room, there's a little button if you're on your computer at the bottom bar in Zoom that says ask for help, and you can click that. When you get sent into a breakout room, you'll have a pop-up on your screen and you'll just click join room. All right, it looks like we have most folks back in the main room. We know that that was a pretty short period of time and some of the small groups might not have had a chance for everyone to share or to wrap up. That's okay. The good news is that you can keep these conversations going on the SGP Facebook group, on the SGP website. But we have had note takers in each of those breakout rooms. They're going to draft a summary of what was discussed, and we'll be sharing out those learnings in a follow-up email. For now, for the rest of our session, I'm going to throw it back to Brenna to wrap us up and take us into the Q&A.
Aha. Okay, now I'm unmuted. Thank you, and yeah, thank you everyone. I know it's hard too with tech difficulties. We had someone who kept getting kicked out, so yeah, just think about this activity and these conversations. Talk to your friends, your family, etc. So just a couple things about inclusivity. We know we said we wouldn't give you the answer, but these are just a couple tips before we go into Q&A. So next slide, please. So really just remembering to center the experiences and opinions of non-binary and intersex and trans people in these conversations. The phrase "nothing about us without us" I really like. So just do your research, understand what non-binary people and intersex people and trans people are saying about their own genders and listen to them. Next. Notice when the binary is used, just like this activity, and question it. And then when you can, advocate for change in your work and your home life, wherever you can. It helps everybody. Next. Don't assume someone's gender based on how they look. We talked about that. People can present any way they want. Respect people's pronouns, proactively share yours. It kind of normalizes this pronoun sharing. Speak inclusivity, even if you don't see, quote, see any non-binary, intersex, or trans people in the room. A lot of people have to stay hidden due to safety concerns or just because they don't necessarily want to dress like whatever your perception of non-binary is. So be inclusive because, you know, we're here secretly. Next. Do your own research online. Don't just, you know, people are talking about this now. Don't just contact your marginalized friend and ask them to explain things to you. There's so much information online, which we will include a lot of in our resources. Next. Diversify your language. We talked about language, so understand that. Also the media that you consume. You know, most of the media we watch is very binary and reinforces gender stereotypes. So try to get some diversity there. Our resource list, like I mentioned, look at it and add to it, especially if there's things in other languages, since we are, you know, I'm creating this list and I speak English. So yeah, please contribute to that. And then lastly, join us for our next webinar, and we'll hear from professionals and activists about operationalizing this work into our gender work. So those more professional focused. All right, next. So then for session 2, the panels that we currently have lined up, I'm super excited to hear from. So we have Crystal Hendricks from Intersex South Africa, Nassim, who is was one of the breakout session hosts today. My chat keeps popping up in the way. And then Sebastian, who is also another breakout session host today. So very excited to have them and possibly one other panelist to hear more about the work that they do. Next. So our contact info, if you have any questions, here's all of our social media and everything. You can come to our Facebook page and continue the conversation, like Noelle said. And yeah, we'll be sending out information. So thanks for joining us today. Now we are going to turn off the recording and go to our unrecorded Q&A. So can